Hey everyone, welcome to this week's podcast. It's good to be back. Thanks for all the feedback that we got. It was amazing to see on various social media platforms all the DMs that we got and the comments of last week. I don't know about you, Al, but I had a lot of fun last week doing the podcast.
Yeah, me too. I mean, and the funny thing is, I didn't think we were going to get much crazier than last week, and then or the week before, and then last week happened, and it it goes to show that you can't predict the weather for or what's going to happen. I mean, so yeah, but definitely had a lot of fun. Really also appreciate the feedback and the comments and love the engagement. Looking forward to more of that.
Well, let's see what we got this week. Continue feedback. If you haven't sent us a note to say hello, please do so. We always like to hear feedback. If you also have some ideas on different topics you'd like us to discuss, send them over because this podcast isn't about for myself and Al, but it's actually for you, the people who are listening and viewing this. So, Al,
Absolutely.
what are we talking about this week?
Yeah, we've got a couple of topics. So we didn't get a chance to address the natural disaster planning and prep that also happened concurrently with the CEO assassination, but we definitely want to touch on that. Um, we we have drones flying around the Northeast, and no one seems to know what's going on with that. So we definitely want to address that a little bit and talk through implications of the drones, the phantom drones that are mysteriously showing up. So definitely want to talk about that and kind of the implications of drones, UAS technology, how that impacts businesses' operations, especially this time of year. Um, so pivoting to cyber, Krispy Kreme's our favorite donut shop for some. Some people are Dunkin's people, and no hate either way. Krispy Kreme's had a cyber attack, a massive one is what it looks like. So definitely want to talk about that. And see, kind of pick at that scab a little bit and see what happened there.
Well, I can tell you our friend Tim Wenzel is probably crushed.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, Tim. But on the good news is maybe the donut prices will go down a little bit now, right? So, you
It depends
know,
how much the
th-
insurance bill goes.
that's right. That's right.
Less promos, no more $1 dozen donuts from Krispy Kremes.
That's right. That's right. And then we have the holidays coming up here in a week. We have, and this is always a great topic to talk about. Just the dynamics of trying to maintain a vigilant workforce, a vigilant workplace in lieu of the holidays. Back to back, Hanukkah for all our friends who celebrate Hanukkah. Then we have Christmas, and then we have New Year's.
Yep.
And to add more fuel to the fire, most of the children are out of school. So now we have kids at home, and then we have families that are typically you're either traveling or family is coming to see you, right? So um, there is a strain on the workforce during this time of year. And the last 2 weeks have proven to be extremely crazy. So there's definitely some impacts that we want to talk about to how do you maintain that vigilance despite the elevated level of distractions that pretty much everybody is going to be dealing with over the next few weeks. Uh, so yeah, lots of stuff to cover.
Well, not just that, because it's the holiday season, people are leaving the offices. So
Yep.
offices may be very quiet for 2 weeks.
Right. So, less eyes on, um, less activity, and distractions, right? So it's a ripe environment for potential activity, right?
Yeah.
So
All right. So where do we want to get started this week? What do we want to start off with?
let's kick it off with our natural disasters, and then we'll roll into the drones, and then our the Great Krispy Kreme donut heist, and then we'll finish it off with some tips on holiday security prep and planning. So
Right. So, how much does 2024 cost businesses in natural disasters? What's the number?
So looking, USA Today posted an article last Thursday. So looking at 2024, we're at $24 billion in damage to businesses, and economic loss. And we're not even at the end of the year yet. So we still have the potential for more disasters before the end of the year.
24 billion. B.
24 billion with a B, 1 year, 12 months, 24 billion. Now I want to compare that number with 2023. 2023 was the highest costing year on record with 28 billion. So we are 4 billion shy from last year. However, that is not a small number by any stretch of the imagination.
So, when was the data point last updated? I'm just very curious. Like, what's the measurement point? Like, with the delineation? Because
Yeah,
I'm still getting the impression, um, at least maybe in Florida, for example, they're still trying to clean up from the what two, maybe three major hurricanes blowing right through the state.
yes, yes. I mean, so I don't think so. Those numbers haven't fully been tabulated yet, right? So we're still kind of in estimate phase, but where we're at from the current cost, meaning dollars spent up to last Friday, the price tag is 24 billion. So we are looking at potentially when we close out the books for 2024, it could very well be 26. It could be another 2 billion depending on one if we have another disaster that pops up over the next, we've got about 2 more weeks left in the year. And then we still don't know the full cost of the hurricane in North Carolina, the impacts there in Western North Carolina. So we're still getting numbers in from that. So it could be it could be more, right? I hope we don't I hope we don't end up with the final number of 29 billion and 2024 is worse than 2023. But it is very possible.
So, let's just say the dreaded words. What could possibly go wrong?
I mean, we are knee deep in winter. One good blizzard, costs us a ton of money, right? A blizzard, another hurricane blows in. I think I just saw on the weather blotter we have a cyclone in the Pacific, so there's potential there. We have, I mean, hurricane season technically starts in August and ends in like early January, technically. Um, we could get another hurricane. That's very possible. I hope not. I really, I really hope not. But it's very possible we get another hurricane.
Yeah, well,
Uh,
Christmas Day, the big one happens here in Southern California. We fall into the ocean.
and that's another. We are both in California, where the tectonic plates have a mind of their own, and so could we see a Christmas Day earthquake? I hope not. Knock on wood. But that would be catastrophic for several reasons, right? But the cost of that, I mean, and we have to consider too, like, okay, the hurricane hit North Carolina. It hit, like parts of Georgia and South Carolina, where primarily the impact zone, unfortunately, for the people who live there, but thankfully for the large urban areas, it impacted more of a rural area. Now, I was on the ground in 2005 during Hurricane Katrina. Major urban area, blasted, New Orleans blasted by a hurricane, category 3 hurricane, massive surge wave. Um, so, you have one of these disasters in a large urban area, or a large coastal area like California, where, the majority of our major urban centers are along coastal areas, right? Uh,
Right.
the cost is significantly more, simply because supply and demand and economics, right? Um, you hit a large urban area, the demand for repairs are going to be much higher because of the population density, right? Which,
Right.
unfortunately, economically, it leads to the price gouging, or just increase in costs because of the higher demand, right? I mean, so you just, the cost of this end up being 2, 3, sometimes 4x more than what it would traditionally cost to repair, simply because of that market demand, those dynamics that happen during a disaster. So it's, unfortunately, it's very possible, big natural disaster in California could very well, I think, very well would be in the billions.
Right. So let's look at these natural disasters. Let's dissect them. I'm glad you brought up Hurricane Katrina because I seem to remember reading or at least being briefed on um, several major companies who drill for oil. Their oil rigs got impacted
Yep.
during Hurricane Katrina. And so their business continuity disaster recovery plan was to have everything in a data center. And normally it would work perfectly well, except for the small, incy wincy, teeny weeny, small little fact that all the data was stored in data centers in New Orleans,
Yeah.
and no one could access it because the entire town was flooded out.
Right. Yep.
So,
All true. So I think, I mean, this leads to a great discussion of, you can't create the plan when the crisis is happening, right? And with hurricanes specifically, we have a general idea where they're going to go, but we don't know exactly where they're going to hit. Hurricanes have a mind of their own,
right,
and a lot of times in disaster recovery, disaster mitigation, we try to find the simplest, quickest solution, simply because it's like, okay, if X happens, then we'll do Y because it makes sense. It's cost effective for the business. And, you always hear, what's the likelihood this could possibly happen? It's impossible. And then the impossible happens. And now you have a big issue, right? So, I think, from when you look at disaster planning and crisis action planning, you really have to consider the overall impacts, the long-term impacts of a disaster in the area, and looking off-site, well off-site. Obviously, they went to New Orleans, but that was the wrong answer because New Orleans got smashed by the hurricane as well, right? So, but had they gone to Arkansas, one state north, or had they even gone to, like, Shreveport, or, northern Louisiana, they likely would have been fine, right? So I think, and it's not to poke their eyes out about, oh, you guys messed up this and that. I don't think we learned a lot out of Katrina in disaster recovery and crisis action planning because of all the lessons learned, right? And that's a big one. Is, yes, it's great to be close and accessible to your data, or to your business continuity operations center, but it does you no good if that area gets smashed too. So moving well off site, away from any disasters, is a better plan, right? And again, one of the lessons that we learned in Katrina, the other lesson we learned was that the emergency services are likely going to be ineffective initially, because when we talk about emergency services personnel in an area, they also live there most likely, or they live within, like, 20, 30 miles of that area. So they're contending with what's going on with my family. Is my house still standing? I have to make the tough choice now as a police officer, as a fireman, or as a first responder, EMT, emergency services. Am I going to go to work, or am I going to handle what's going on at home, right? And that's no judgment to anyone who's had to make that tough choice, because that's not an easy choice to make. But that's something that we have to contend with, right? And hence there were some issues there also with getting the National Guard in quick enough, and fully understanding, like, okay, it's state of emergency. We need to have augmented resources in place, right? Uh,
Right.
when I was on the ground there, I got there about 5 days after the actual storm hit, and so I was coming in pretty fresh, into the disaster zone, and I can tell you, we had police officers and fire departments from all over the country that had surge resources to help support that, and that's good, and that's what needs to happen. But what does that also mean? It means that all those jurisdictions that sent people to help support that disaster, they're now short staffed, right? So when we consider the impacts of a disaster, say, if you live on the eastern seaboard and the disaster's down in, Texas or New Orleans, but now your local government has sent resources down to support that, you're now your town, your local jurisdiction is now less capable, right? And so there are national impacts to natural disasters. So I don't think people fully understand the dynamics there when it comes to, like, it's a big impact across the nation, because typically FEMA is going to get involved if it's a big enough deal, which means now you're surging in resources, from other states, and then you're also bringing in National Guardsmen from other states to support that as well, which now means if another disaster happens, you've got to scale resources back, right? And
It,
the
it,
same thing happens. So when we talk about the impact to the business, right? Well, you've now just brought in, say, hundreds or thousands of support personnel to clean up this disaster, right? What does that do? What does that impact the price of fuel, the price of food, hotel room availability? If you're trying to get back in to check on your sites, are there going to be any rental cars left at the airport? Probably not, right? So these are all things you got to consider when you're doing your crisis action planning and your disaster recovery. So I'm a big proponent of find a place way off site where you can continue operating with little impact, where not a lot of people are going to, because something like a rental car, and 2005 is pre-Uber, pre-Lyft, right? If you don't have a rental car, because the taxis weren't running, there were no cars are all flooded out. There's no taxis. So if you're not getting a rental car, and people were getting rental cars, like they were going to Houston, they were going to Shreveport, they were going to Little Rock, getting rental cars and then driving in, because you couldn't get a rental car in anywhere near New Orleans.
hear that, Gen Airs? You need to learn how to drive.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I think there's so many different layers of impact here when it comes to a natural disaster, right? Which then impact other aspects of the country that people don't even consider, right?
Yeah. So you're raising some really, really good points, especially here in Southern California or in California in general. We have four seasons too, fire, flood, earthquakes, Santa Ana winds.
That's right.
Those are our four seasons. We're in the middle of Santa Ana wind season right now. And as it made the spotlight or headlines last week, the entire Malibu hillside caught fire overnight. And what started as a small fire is now, 2,000, 3,000 acres,
Yeah.
forcing Pepperdine University to shelter in place. Think of the continuity and disasters just to the area, and it's impacting people. Whether you're rich or poor, whether you're a student or you're a celebrity. It's a great example that disasters don't discriminate.
They do not. They do not. Not one bit. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, not just from a business perspective, right? Because those all those businesses are impacted right now. Um, but think about the community as well. Like some of these kids are set to graduate, right? Pepperdine was likely going to have a graduation ceremony, so people were flying in. You know, all that is now impacted, right? Think about the celebrities, who, you know, for the most part, it's a lot of Hollywood people, right? A lot of Hollywood or TV celebrities that live in the Malibu area. What does that do for that industry, the film industry, right? What's the impact there? These people are leaving, but understanding the terrain and geography of the Malibu Hills, you don't have a lot of ways to get in and get out.
Yep.
So when the evacuation order is given, if you don't leave, it's a high risk that you're not going to be able to get out. And so what's your plan? And the reason I bring this up is, um, when you're looking at it from, you know, a disaster recovery or business continuity of ops from any business, you know, what direction have you given your employees about what you're going to do? You know, have you considered, and this is a lot of companies don't consider this, why not fly your critical personnel out of there, put them up in a hotel, and continue the business moving, get them off site, get their families off site, right? When you consider the distractions that are involved, your key personnel, hey, why don't we're gonna pay a 1 week vacation for you guys to go, you know, to wherever, right? You're gonna go to Lake Tahoe and you're gonna hang out in Lake Tahoe for a little bit, and we're gonna have a team building event. We're gonna have, you know, put everybody up. You guys can shelter in place in Lake Tahoe, make it fun, right? Bring your families as well. We'll cover this. And as soon as we evaluate the fallout of the disaster, you know, we'll figure out, you know, how we get you guys all back, right? But imagine if we took that approach to disaster planning, right? I mean,
Well, I mean, like just disaster planning. I think the biggest failure in business continuity, disaster recovery, operational resilience, testing these programs.
yeah, the pressure testing, it's definitely lacking. And it's not just the natural disaster, man-made disaster. It's a lot of things. Like, I mean, how many times, unfortunately, have we seen active shooters and there's like, yeah, we had a plan in place, but we never practiced it. Or even like fire drills, right? When we're children in school, like we practice the fire drill, right? But
Yeah.
how many times do we do it as adults? How many times do we actually practice a fire drill? A lot of businesses don't, you know. And a fire is a relatively, you know, not downplaying it, but it's usually a fairly localized event that we have systems in place to compensate. If you have a bad fire evacuation plan, there's systems in place through the community to help mitigate that. We got fire alarms, we got smoke alarms, we got fire extinguishers everywhere, we got good quality, you know, fire departments that can come in and help you overcome a bad plan, right?
Yeah.
However, um, earthquake. Say we have an earthquake, and it's absolutely a reality here in California. Earthquakes are a reality. There's no level of community support that can overcome an event like that. Like you are stuck. You might be buried under rubble. You might be trapped in a building. What are you going to do? You know what, as an individual, but then also as a business, you know, how have you prepared your staff for that, right? Because those things, they come with little warning. The earthquake comes with little warning, and it's it. Everything is smashed, you know, 15, 20 seconds later, you know, disaster, right?
But I think it goes to our society too as well. What we think about resilience and what we think about survivability. So I think it was Dr. Lucy Jones, the seismologist, now retired from the United States USGS. I think she made a comment a few months back when we had the series of earthquakes that happened throughout the Southern California area, about the need for building codes need to be updated for resilience. And her point was that, as a society, we've focused so much on survivability, but, we build buildings to a certain building code, and the building code is to survive. But it was never meant or built or designed for resilience. And
Right.
I was surprised about that. And she was explaining is most of it is because, there's an additional operational cost to actually making it to resilience. But if you look at the grand picture of everything, the cost is only 5 or 10% more to make your buildings more resilient. So you don't just have a survivability factor, but you also have a resilience factor built in. And
Right.
so, if we're not building to that resilience standard, then what? We have to start all over again on our investments. So everything we did just gets flushed down the toilet. I think to her point, and we can look at it maybe it's a systemic thing in our culture or maybe, in our industries, is that we just focus on so much short term matters. We just want to see the short term dollar. How do we make the almighty dollar? And I think that is kind of concerning because uh, if we only spent 10% more to save way more, not having to rebuild the building from scratch and lose the operational aspects of our businesses, why aren't we building to that spec? It shocked me when she told me that. I always assumed building codes were built in a way to ensure resilience operations. I didn't realize it was a step lower, being just survivability. And so, think of the money that we could save. That $24 billion that you're just talking about from just natural disasters. Imagine if we built slightly higher to a higher spec just to be more resilient buildings. How much would that have actually potentially induced in cost savings, not just to business owners, but to taxpayers in general?
Right. Well, and that's always that. I think to your point of focusing on the short term, that's exactly it. When we focus on the short term, we miss the big picture. We miss the 24 billion, the 28 billion, the I think 22 billion in 2022 that we are ultimately going to end up paying out anyway to get these buildings back up and get these facilities moving again. So to your point, like preventative care versus, reactive care, right? Why don't we just invest the dollars up front now and do this? The good news is um, FEMA and Department of Homeland Security both have government money that you can tap into, especially if your facility is considered critical infrastructure. So when we talk about critical infrastructure, we're talking about, power plants, gas refineries, oil refineries, bridges, um, transportation hubs, public transit, anything that's critical for, the day to day underscore like first layer business operations. Data centers also are included in critical infrastructure, um, as well as some power distribution plants, other stuff. And what a lot of people don't understand is a lot of critical infrastructure in the United States is actually privately owned. It's not publicly owned, or if it is publicly owned, it's privately managed. And so there are several programs in place that allow you to use government funds to do exactly that, to improve upon critical infrastructure with the specific vein of resilience, to ensure that that critical infrastructure is resilient in the wake of a natural disaster or man-made disaster. So I think there, it's hard to change a building code because of the process involved in dealing with the organizations and petitioning and this and that. And I still think it needs to happen 100%. I just know that's a slower road to success than potentially leveraging yearly allocated funds by FEMA and Department of Homeland Security to at least, get some progress made when it comes to updating some of these buildings for resilience specifically, right? And you consider, okay, all the buildings in downtown LA survive. We don't have any casualties. Everyone's still alive, but there's no power and there's no internet. Like,
Or water.
what good did that do for any of us, right? I mean, look, we're alive and that's great. Awesome. No loss of life. Awesome. Buildings are intact. Great. But we still are impact. We can't get any work done. In these building codes, I believe were probably established well before we were as connected as we are now as a society, right? So
Yeah.
cell towers go down or cell towers are impacted. A pop site goes down because it's flooded from whatever, right? We are unable to continue doing business, even though everyone survives, all the buildings are intact. We still can't do business. So it speaks to like what's the outcome we're looking. What are these building code outcomes aim to do? It's to ensure, right, one, like you mentioned, survivability. Yes, everyone survives, the building survives, and that's absolutely important. But let's take it to the next level. Not only do we survive, we're able to continue with minimal interruption, continue doing business. That's, I think, what the taxpayers are looking for. That's when they consider like the outcome that the taxpayers are paying for. That's what they're paying for. That's what they believe they're paying for. And unfortunately, that's not what we have right now. And that's what we should be aiming to do or get to, right?
Right. I think, people forget the government, if you look at one side of the aisle, actually, I think both sides of the aisle, they want to cut down the national debt. But if you're going to cut down on the national debt, you have to stop spending money. But if you stop spending money on helping people rebuild their lives, you're going to quickly, be not in office. So,
Right.
they're having to spend that kind of money anyway. So rather than just, treat the symptom, you have to solve that problem. And then the problem is, yes, I know building codes, that's the minimum, but there's nothing that says one can't voluntarily build to a higher code, whatever that might be. Yes, you do pay the cost, but you can build to that higher code. And, maybe that will start moving at least with some buildings. And granted, I know everyone's rushing to do the minimum, but I think there's something to be said that, if that cost is truly, as Dr. Jones says, it was like, a minimum investment, 5-10% more, that's a hell of a cheap investment in my book to
Well,
guarantee
absolutely.
resilience.
When you consider, I think the average building in the United States is 70 years old. So you consider when you consider like, okay, so we have some buildings in some cities that, century buildings, they're 100 years old, and they've been gutted, they've been revamped, and they've been updated, HVAC code and all that. But when you consider how long our buildings, we anticipate them being, around, right? Get it right get it right at the initial shot, right? I mean, we obviously, the guys who built the buildings in the 1920s, they had no, like, internet wasn't a thing, connectivity wasn't a thing, even HVAC wasn't really a thing. Like they didn't know about these technologies, right? But the point is, if you plan for that unknown, that X factor, like there'll be new technologies that potentially will have to incorporate into this building. And how do we make this thing resilient? Like you mentioned, how do we make this building resilient? Do we need to have a separate water source, dual redundancy power? How do we keep this thing, how do we keep this building moving? How do we keep the occupants safe and effectively able to continue working, past the point of disaster? And I think that is important. That's important to start incorporating when we look at, like you mentioned, the long-term global cost of a natural disaster. I think it took quite a while to close out the books on Katrina.
How long?
I want to say it was almost 7 or 8 years of, it's still likely ongoing in some cases on certain jurisdictions. It takes a long time to close out the books on a natural disaster. So we're continually paying for this, well past the point of disaster, right? So I think from a cost perspective, it's really important that we consider that, of what, how are we designing these buildings? And then to that point, our crisis action planning, our disaster recovery prep, our business continuity ops, the better our plans are, the better our execution, the more drills we do. Again, we're less cost to the business, less cost to the taxpayer, less cost overall to the nation, right?
Right.
And you know, here's the funny thing about all of this is the biggest cost to the national debt is it's Medicare and Medicaid. It's like the biggest cost. So when we consider that the medical aspect of our budget is what is really, 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 really driving up the debt, imagine natural disaster, the amount of increase to that medical liability we have if we have a bad plan, right? I mean, you consider senior citizens, and children cost the most on the medical front because just of senior citizens, obviously they're elderly, they're more susceptible to things, right? Children, again, young, also susceptible, right? They haven't their immune system hasn't fully developed. But you consider the amount of cost just from a medical aspect after a natural disaster. Um, so you consider how much that added to the national debt, right? For that conversation, it makes a lot of sense for us to, if we can reduce that number too, right? Because we have smart buildings, we have resilient buildings, we have the ability to continue doing business. We're actually doing a lot to stop, the excessive debt spending that's occurring, right? So I think it's just a different way of viewing the problem overall. I mean, we can look at natural disasters through a lens and say, oh, that costs us this much, but it actually costs us a lot more when we look at all the residual effects and the second and third order effects and the costing, right? And so we have to start taking that long look, that big picture view. Like you mentioned, we're worried about the short-term dollar, short-term spend. The problem is if we don't look at the big picture, that short-term dollar keeps costing us more and more and more money, right?
Exactly. And I was just thinking, just everything that's been going on. Think about the fires in Maui or the tsunami that we had warning 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Think about just the economic disruptions, just to the various flooding, fires, earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, um, snowmageddons. You take your pick, and
Well,
it's very disruptive events.
I mean, I can tell you, like my daughter goes to school in Marin County, and I got a notification, and I'm down in I'm traveling. I'm not at home that week, right? So she's in Marin County. I get a notification from the school, tsunami heading towards Marin County. Uh, Imagine my mind state, and as an employee, am I really focused on the job right now, or am I freaking out because my 6-year-old daughter might be in the path of a tsunami, right? So
Yeah.
there's that aspect as well, of a natural disaster might be occurring, and a lot of people commute, right? A lot of this, especially in California and some of the bigger urban areas, we got people commuting in 40, 50, 60 miles, like a disaster 40 miles away from San Francisco still impacting a lot of people who work in San Francisco, right?
Uh,
So, uh,
1989 Loma Prieta earthquake is a great example where it shut down the entire city. Uh,
yeah,
and almost burned the entire city to a crisp. If it wasn't for a fact that they didn't happen to lose their their firefighting water tugboat or something like that.
yeah, yeah,
It's like south, what was it called? Like an hour south of the wherever they happened, and you had freeway sandwiching, you had the Marina district catching on fire. The impact was severe.
right, right. Well, and you think, I mean, they had the reservoir down there. I think it's just south of the 92 freeway, um, near San Mateo and Palo Alto. So they're able to tap into that reservoir, which allowed them to get water where it needed to go to the city. But you can imagine if it was big enough where they weren't able to get water into the city. I mean, we would have had like a major disaster. Not that this wasn't a major disaster, but it would have been magnitudes worse. And you talk about the loss of life, because I mean, guys who've been to the Bay Area understand, like, you have the Golden Gate Bridge going out, you have the Bay Bridge going out, which collapsed in this case.
Oh
Uh,
yes, that
and
one.
and then you have the 101 going south, right? Or you have the 580 or the 280. I'm getting my highways messed up here, but you only have four ways in and out of the city essentially, and that's when there's no traffic and there's no debris and there's nothing collapsed blocking you, right?
Right.
In this case, it would have been impossible for anyone to have left the city, and we would have seen an epic disaster to magnitudes we probably couldn't understand.
Yeah. I think, I think earthquakes is one of those really cool examples where it isn't just a man-made disaster, but it also triggers a series of human-made disasters
Right.
just by virtue of, all the human infrastructure that is breaking. And
Right.
if left unchecked, it just spurs and just grows uncontrolled, like those fires, because those fires weren't caused by an earthquake. Those fires were caused by damage to man-made infrastructure, which
Yeah,
then
gas pipes and gas
translates. Yeah,
stations rupturing, and
exactly.
yeah, I mean, earthquakes are definitely, like, when I consider the scariest natural disaster in my opinion. My top two tied are earthquakes and hurricanes. But I give the edge to earthquakes simply because it's really hard for us to predict.
Yep.
Um, and the amount of devastation that you get from an earthquake, to your point, and the residual effects of the man-made infrastructure crumbling, it happens so fast. People assume it's I was down in Nepal after the earthquake there, and we were getting aftershocks. So that was I think a 9.9 on the Richter scale, which is off the charts. The aftershocks we were getting when I was there were on the 7 and the 8 scale. So that was the aftershocks. So, and it was 2 or 3 seconds. These things, the building shaking for 2 or 3 seconds, and you go back outside and things are just level. And I don't think people can understand, like, 10 or 15 seconds. If you've never been in an earthquake, you barely even know, like, by the time you process what's happening, like, oh my God, the building's shaking, this is an earthquake. It ends and things have fallen on the ground, and the whole area is upended. People don't even realize what's happening. It's scary. It's very scary.
Yeah. And there's a great recording. Was it like what, 2008, 2009? I forgot which one when it was this happened. It was just by sheer dumb luck. It was NPR's sent a crew to Chengdu, China, and around that point in time, they were doing recordings, to document the culture and do a series on it. And I think it was Melissa Block, the reporter. She happened to have a recording on, and you can see her, the documents, like, oh, well, what's going on here? It's like, oh my goodness, we're having an earthquake.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
Into the middle of the story. Reporter's dream, by the way, but forgetting that aside, but you can, to your point, exactly, like, you're not processing it. It took a good, like, 5, 10, 15 seconds to realize, oh my goodness, we're in the middle of an earthquake.
yeah, the earth is shaking right now. I mean, it is, and I guess the point is, when that happens, when that disaster happens and you've experienced it, you realize why it's important to have that crisis action plan and that disaster recovery plan, that business continuity plan. Because, like, I guess the other point that we haven't really talked to on this is the mentality of the survivors and the people who are having to push through this. I mean,
Right.
you're in shock. You're still trying to process what happened. There's a million thoughts racing through your head, and you literally, like, the last thing on your mind is, oh, what's the next step in the disaster recovery plan? You have to have a reference manual to look at and say, okay, wait a second, let me refocus my energy. Okay, this is what we need to do. This is This is where we go. Who's in charge right now? And that's part of this as well. Is really, and we don't have to go into all the nuances of business continuity operations and disaster recovery, but there has to be that person in charge who makes the decisions, right?
Yeah.
And it's typically your crisis action manager. But it's if you've never practiced this, I promise you, when the disaster happens, you're not going to be able to function. Your team is not going to be able to function. So if you haven't practiced this, or at least gone through the steps, at least, and what we used to do when I worked at the data center in San Francisco, I mean we didn't have the time to run through a full rehearsal because we just you still have business operations happening, but we would chalk talk it. We would go on the whiteboard and we would whiteboard what should happen, and talk through it. And I make sure all my staff knew what to do. And I would ask them, okay, what are you going to do when this happens? And they would tell me something simple like that, a 15-minute whiteboard session, 100 times better than not doing anything at all. Just writing a plan, putting it on the shelf, and never looking at it again until the disaster happens.
Well, Dwight D. Eisenhower said, "What plans are useless, but planning is essential."
Right, 100%. No, no plan survives first contact. What we used to say in the Marines.
Yeah.
Mike Tyson's famous quote: "Everyone's got a plan until you get punched in the face." Right.
Yeah.
And all this is true. All this is true. The best plan, disaster recovery, business continuity operations planning it won't carry you fully through. You're going to have to use your brain power. There's going to be some unforeseen factor that you didn't know about, which happens, and you got to figure that out, and that's okay. But the point is when it comes to this stuff, it's about getting the business moving again.
Yeah.
We know you're not going to move. You're not going to move at 100% because you just had a disaster.
Yeah, like
you got to get the gears moving, and the only way to do that is to have a good plan in place.
yeah. One thing I love about having good proper plans and training, by the way, I wish we all would adopt more of the mentality like the aviation industry, where
Yeah.
the focus is on life safety. It is 100% not just about survivability, but they want people to walk away from an airplane crash completely and intact. That's always their goal. And one thing I always admire is that no matter how great or how small the incident is, they always try to reverse engineer everything possible to understand the who, what, when, where, why, and how. And even the smallest lessons learned, it is dissected and reverse engineered and disseminated to constantly improve people, process, technology all around. So, like, good example, Captain Sullenberg, who flew U.S. Ares 1549. Um, of course, aviation forces you all the training. Something as simple as them turning on the auxiliary power unit made the huge difference in actually controlling the Airbus A320, landing safely into the Hudson, and with everyone surviving. It was something that small. If they followed that checklist to a T, I think it was something like 15/20th or whatever, somewhere on the low on the checklist.
Yeah.
Very top. That was the first thing he did, was turn on the APU after losing all power, and that in itself constituted a whole change in how they thought about the importance of an APU and its ability to respond in that order. Or I think about what was it, the Asiana flight, the one that came in too shallow at San Francisco International. A lot of lessons learned there too about response, coordination, procedures. Unfortunately, it looked like there was some miscommunication between the city and the airport staff, as well as I think one of the fire truck tenders may have accidentally run over someone. But all these little different life lessons contributed to a better aviation program. And it's not by accident that the aviation is now one of the safest ways to fly. And it's because they went the fully regulated route where they said, okay, we're not going to tolerate the loss of life anymore. We're going to say, hey, we're going to implement all these safety controls, look at how we do at risk, how we build airplanes, how we regulate them, how we design them, how we architect them. Everything is built for people to walk away as best as possible, and that's amazing. And I wish, when we do business continuity and disaster recovery, we're treating not just the building as a person, but I wish we treat the people who live in and work inside the building as the people that they are, and then the business in itself as a living, breathing individual, organic in nature, and that also has to survive, and not just something you just milk for dollars. And I wish that human element, that humanity aspect, of that business was really there, because I think it demonstrate, yeah, you may, in the case of a plane crashing, yes, you may use the plane, but the fact is, everyone walked away. That is amazing in itself. In like Cactus 1549, and Agiana flying right smack into the wall with a major disaster, and you can see the plane turning over. Again, the planes were designed in a way that the 777, almost everybody survived. That's unheard of, and yet,
Yeah.
when we think about how we do things, today in every other industry, you kind of go, huh, like, what's the outcome, like, what how do we know what we're doing is not going to take or kill somebody. Just over the hill, where I am, because I'm based in the city of industry. We just had a very big man-made disaster just happen, and it's taken out a whole bunch of series of hospitals, and it's the PIH ransomware incident. uh, you know, Ransoming a healthcare facility. My question is, how many people had critical surgery scheduled and they can't pull up the electronic medical records? Or
Right.
how many people had to be diverted away because they can't check? Sorry, how many people died potentially because ambulances had to be turned away from their facilities to respond to a medical emergency? I don't know, but I do know, like in Germany, there was at least one person who's died because of a ransomware attack. And that was because the hospital they had to divert was like another 5-10 minutes away, and the patient didn't survive a heart attack.
Right.
Something like this we're not thinking about. And, until my question I always ask myself was, what is it going to take before we start taking man-made disasters as well as man-made and human-made disasters as well as natural disasters more seriously?
It's tough to say. I mean, how many hurricanes and wildfire? I mean, here in California, I mean, we lost the city of Paradise to a massive, massive wildfire. And a good friend of mine lost his home in that. Um, and I think there's a lot of people who either know someone or themselves in this state have dealt with fires, right? Yet there seems to be little more increased funding to Cal Fire to fight these things. But the issue here is we can throw money at whatever problem we want. It doesn't necessarily mean we're going to solve it, right? It just means we're going to spend more money, um, and we're not quite sure if we're getting a better result. I think, to your point, we have to think about these things differently. We have to take a very long term look at what does this type of investment, what is this type of, or what is the type of investment needed to stop this from being as impactful, whatever the event be, earthquake, fire, flood. um, to your point, so reduce the amount of loss of life, reduce the amount of infrastructure lost. um, I think the aviation industry, to your point as well, has done an amazing job in being very brutally honest with themselves about what went right, what went wrong, and then taking it upon themselves to take the corrective action immediately and solve the issue. I will say, and I know Boeing has been beat up in the press as of late for some of the issues that they've had, and Airbus had some issues, and I get all that, but I would say I've seen fewer industries able to like implement a change as quickly as aviation. Um, and that's saying a lot because they don't necessarily. It still takes about a year or a year and a half for them to do that, but it's funny. So much money is tied up with the perception of safety with air travel. Like if people say we're not flying anymore, that industry goes under quickly. Um, it's almost people don't believe me, but I say it's almost a symbiotic relationship between the travelers and the airline companies. Because if there's even a hint that flying is unsafe, people don't want to fly, and that's millions of dollars of revenue loss for these companies.
Yeah.
And if you don't believe me, look at the share prices during COVID. And that was a natural disaster that didn't even impact like aviation directly. It was just people thought if I get on a plane on a tube with a bunch of people, I'm going to get sick and I'm going to die. Right. It had nothing to do with the safety of the airplane. It had everything to do with health safety. But I think there's a lot of lessons local jurisdictions, other industries can take from the aviation industry on you know what, we have to take a long-term view because because aviation does take a long-term view on this of they look at, okay, if I can get a safer airplane but I can also get it to carry more cargo, more people, and I have survivability in the 95 percentile of that plane should something go wrong. um, it is in my direct benefit to invest as much as I can to making that airframe possible because that's going to save me money in the long term. It's going to make me money in the long term because I'll be able to deliver more people and more cargo more efficiently. Um, but it's also doing everyone a service, and it's really building confidence in the customer base, right? And
Right.
I think that is also something you have to consider when you do disaster recovery and business continuity ops. What level of confidence is your customer base going to have in your business if something like a fire or flood, hurricane takes you completely out, right?
Yeah, and I think also to the point, whether it be a man-made disaster or a human-made disaster, I think we also have to consider the fact that, like in aviation, which is, these disasters are all man-made generally, um, that they don't play the blame game too as
Right.
well. There is no such thing as a scapegoat. They want to figure out root cause, and because they've gotten to a point where they understand it is not a single failure that brings an airplane down. It is a series of concentric failures that just all happen to line up perfectly. That makes everything happen where a plane falls out of the sky and then a crash. It has to be a perfect set of conditions, and they take the time to understand everything. They're not there to play the blame game. They're there to understand root cause, and they do their best, to get all the data and bring it under one roof so they can look at it with a critical eye, so that they can make critical recommendations to make changes. And you can look at every crash, every modern crash in aviation history. They've done that so with such great scrutiny. Anytime there's anything that happens, they want to understand it. For example, I think it was the first 777 that ever crashed. It was the Speedbird 38, British Airways 38.
Yep.
It was a great example. No one ever in history could have thought ice could bring down a mighty 777. That was unheard of, and it was something as small as a small engine design, flaw was, and then water building up, and how you operate it, and when it brought down a 777. That was it.
Yep. Small little oversight, but obviously led to big implications to the entire industry.
Exactly.
Well, speaking of aviation and airplanes, we had some drone sightings over the last week in New Jersey. So this has been a very interesting development. The New York and New Jersey and Pennsylvania have had a real interesting 2 weeks. First, we have an assassination of a CEO in broad daylight. Then we have a little battle for extradition after we catch the assassin in Pennsylvania. Now we have drones flying over New Jersey, primarily northern New Jersey, and then there was some spotted in Connecticut and Massachusetts. Now there's drone sightings everywhere. I think the mass hysteria has caught on, and people are seeing drones everywhere. So I figure now's a great time for us to pivot to the drone issue, if you're good with that.
So my first question on this, okay, do you think it's overblown? 'Cause there's a part of me that says it is overblown, and then the part of me that says, if it was around an airport, that then there's a big concern. So what's your take here?
Yeah, this is a great question. I mean, so I think it's important for us to kind of lay out what the current regulations are for drones, because I think a lot of this stems from some miseducation on what the actual standards are for commercial and recreational drone pilots, right? So, and I've got the article here, and we'll post all this for everyone so they can take a look at it. But I think when I go over some of this stuff, I think some of the mystique gets eliminated, which is important, because that's what a lot of this is let's eliminate the mystique, and then let's have an actual conversation about what we're seeing, right? So here's the thing, and these are just general rules for flying drones. Legally, drones, non-commercial drones, recreational drones, must fly below 400 feet, right? Okay, so let's keep that in mind. 400 feet is your altitude ceiling. All drones must be registered, so you have to register your drone with the FAA. And when you buy one, if anyone's never bought a drone, when you buy a drone, there's a registration form. Like if you buy a DJI, which I've used before, you register it, you go onto the FAA website, you register your drone and all that. So there's a registration process for the drone, right?
Right.
On top of that, it can't weigh more than 55 pounds, 25 kilograms, 55 pounds. So all non-commercial recreational drones have to fit into this category, right? There are established no drone zones. So there are areas in certain jurisdictions where you can't fly drones, and those signs should be posted, right? There is a safety app that the FAA gives you, which actually gives you that you're basically essentially sharing your GPS location of your drone with the FAA. So the FAA has the ability to actually track all the registered drones, anyone who's using this app flying a drone. They have the ability to track the drone's GPS location via the cell towers and things like that. So it's not 100% accurate, but if you geofence areas, you're the FAA, you kind of know when things are coming in and out, right? You have your buffer zone, so you should have an idea. They should have an idea. We would expect them to have some type of idea of registered drones flying and a GPS location being shared, right?
Right.
Don't 100% quote me on this next one, but because the last time I was doing drone stuff was about 5 years ago. But my understanding is you cannot fly a drone within 5 miles of a commercial airport, or an active airfield in general. Now there are certain exceptions to that rule for various different things, like the Bay Area. We've been talking about the Bay a lot. It's very congested. It's hard to be outside of that 5 mile radius from an active airstrip when you're in the Bay Area. It's just a reality due to the congestion. So I know that there in the Bay Area, there were certain parks, certain areas where you could fly drones because they were out of the active air channel where planes were flying to actually get to SFO, SJC, or Oakland Airport. So there are some exceptions to that, but generally speaking, within 5 miles of an active airstrip, you're not supposed to fly drones unless you have permission from the FAA, right? So,
or the local control tower.
right, or local control tower. So there's a process here when it comes to operating a drone. Now, can people just buy a drone off of Amazon, and then just fly one on their own without doing any of this? Yes, 100%, absolutely, that's possible. So I'm not taking that away from anyone, or as a probability of that could be happening here. But I think, like, when we look at the commercial drones, you have to have a commercial drone pilot license if you're going to fly a commercial drone, right? And that's through the FAA. Okay. Um, there is a certification rating that you get when it comes to commercial drones, and there's different certification um, levels, right? And then there's an FAA tracking number, an FTN, that is tied to your name, right? So when you're operating one of these drones, you have like people. There's a drone registration, and then there's the FTN, which ties the drone to your license, right? On top of that, if you're flying at night, which a lot of the reports were flying at night, flying over people, moving vehicles, you have to have airspace authorization for night operations. So, why am I saying all this? Why am I reiterating all this? Because if we look at these reports, it's typically at night. It's typically they're saying they're large drones. They're not small ones. They're saying they're large drones, and they're saying that they're coming around people's homes or backyards or areas like that, and around sensitive facilities. Right? FAA has come out and said that there's been nothing illegal yet about this. They don't see any laws or airspace being violated or restricted. But it's concerning people because they're like, well, I've never seen drones flying here. Why are they flying now? Right. So let's just take everything I just said and just read, and let's go off the reports that we hear. I, I, I tend to find it hard to believe that this is like a lot of malice going on here, and I hope I'm not proven wrong. I don't know if I'll put my foot in my mouth next week.
For every $1, you're the betting man of $1.
Yeah. I mean, I think I've heard the theory that this could be a cover for an intelligence operation for a near peer actor like Russia, China, Iran. I tend to think like that's definitely possible, right? It's definitely possible. I'm not gonna discount that, but we have an open skies treaty with Russia, meaning both Russia and the United States have free reign of overflights with satellites over the airspace. So, is there a need for Russians to fly drones at night in New York City or New Jersey? Not really. We give them access to our airspace to take pictures of everything already. That's been a part of a treaty, I think, since like 1993 or four. So there's not a real need for them to do that. People have said, well, it's Chinese agents. And there was an incident where a Chinese national was arrested before he got on his flight for operating a drone illegally. So I can see why you could make the jump and the connection. The PRC, People's Republic of China, the government there, has been very, 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 very candid about their collection of personal data, either through cyber means or physical means like drone stuff. So it could be that, but again, there's much easier ways for them to obtain that same information without going through this. So what do I think this is? I think there was maybe a couple incidences of either a commercial operator or recreational operators flying around at night. The panic and hysteria happened. Somebody came up with the idea of an Iranian mothership. It was a congressman. Now, when you see lights in the sky, this feeds into the panic groupthink mentality, right? Where now you see lights in the sky, you're not sure what, like, oh, is that a commercial airplane? Is that a drone? Some of the descriptions I've seen is like, this is a car-sized object that sounds like a snowmobile flying over me. Well, if that's the case, right? it's obviously more than 55 pounds if you're telling me that's what it is, right? So you're automatically saying, okay, it's potentially a commercial drone operator, right? So I think the first question is, who are the commercial drone operators in that area? Go check the FAA logs. Was there any authorized commercial drone flights through that area, right? Things people don't understand or don't consider is your right to privacy does not extend to the airspace over your house. So there are technically people can fly drones over your house unless you live in a restricted airspace place, or there's few limitations to that. HOAs sometimes have the ability to restrict drone flights, but you don't have a right to privacy over the airspace of your house. So
Yeah,
people can fly over your house. Companies do it all the time. They fly over your house and take pictures, and then they incorporate it into some mapping software, right? I mean, this is just
insurance companies is a great example.
right. So I think there's a little bit of feeding of the panic. There's a little bit of, you know, hey, this is cool. Maybe I can get in the news. I'm gonna go fly a drone at night too to see what happens, right? There's some of that. I think there's some miseducation on what an actual drone is, what the standards are, right? That's why I read the standards out so everyone can understand the process here. I I just think this is a lot of, at least from what I can tell, right? Again, I hope I'm not proven wrong next week. I hope it's not something nefarious, because I'm gonna have to put my foot in my mouth. But I don't see it being um as crazy or as blown up as people are making it. Now there's I definitely subscribe to the fact that maybe it is a intelligence operation that's being used as, being covered by civilians to collect. That's very possible. I think that could be the case potentially, but I'm not seeing the panic, the level of, or I'm not seeing the activity being as nefarious versus the level of panic that we're seeing from people. Now I will say this: the impact here, it did stop air travel for a little bit. I was delayed going to New York last week. And so there's definitely impact. So even if it is nothing, and even if it's just innocuous, there's still been business impacts. There's still been impacts to travelers at a very critical time of the year. So I guess my point is, irrespective of whether it's an intelligence collection operation from a near peer or terrorist organization, whether it's a bunch of guys having fun trying to get people riled up, or it's a government operation, that they're testing something out. Either way, it's impacted business at this point. We have to look at the outcome, right? So we're feeling the impacts of this. I think the FAA, the local jurisdictions, need to be more proactive on communicating what they know, and just putting an end to the rumors, if that's what they are. If there is something legitimately nefarious happening, I think that needs to be addressed as well, because I think people should be able to make a travel decision based on all the information. And if they believe that there is a threat, or that there is an issue, that one of these drones may be trying to hit an airplane or cause some issues, it needs to be put out there to the public. I'm a big believer of being transparent, even with the security orgs that I work with. Be transparent, let everybody know what the issues are, let them make their own decision. Everyone has their own risk management calculus that they have for themselves, and you got to make that decision for yourself, right? But I don't see a lot of information that, or data that would support it's an Iranian mothership, or it's a nefarious group doing something. Um, Again, we just don't have a lot of information. We just have the sightings, right? So it is
Yeah.
what it is.
I think the thing to be mindful of is normalization. Um, Drones in my book are still, a it's a rare sight to behold, at least in my book.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not something that we've ingested into normalized society. Something to I keep in mind about you know normalizing risk. And I'm going to go back to this subject, not trying to beat the horse dead, but when we see an airplane fall out of the sky, every time it happens, it's on the news cycle for like weeks on end and everything like that. Plane had this, plane had that. It's not something that we normalize typically. Even though statistically, if you watch the news and everything like that, you would think um, that planes are an unsafe way to fly, when in reality, it's one of the safest ways to travel.
Right, right.
You're statistically more likely to get injured or die in a car crash than you are actually,
Significantly higher too.
yeah,
Significantly higher.
yeah, than actually riding an airplane. And yet, every day we get into our cars and drive. We've normalized that risk. And I think there's something they've said about drones. Like we haven't normalized drones in our society. Um, Kind of a fun point in, from a normalization perspective. Was that maybe last week or was it 2 weeks ago? Where comedian Jimmy Kimmel played a prank on his Aunt Chippy, where they put her in a Waymo.
Yeah. Right. Right.
And it completely scared them. It just scared her to wits. Seeing, a Waymo driving and there's around and there's no one behind the wheel. There's nothing, that's not something we've normalized yet.
Right.
And, there's a part of me that goes, maybe it's even not even just the education piece, it's also the normalization piece of, drones. I don't think we've normalized drones quite yet into modern society. There's also another part of me that just thinks about, drones. I'm a drone operator. I own a DJI. But, if you're that stupid enough to be doing something to piss off people on a, cutting edge piece of technology, you kind of deserve to get your license taken away
Right.
at this point. Inducing fear and panic, for maybe that for the Instagram or for the gram or for your TikTok views, probably not a good idea. I mean, you're just drawing ire into an industry, which I think as we're progressing into this era, as until people really adopt it en masse and we normalize it, we might need to be respectful because was it our upcoming administration? Didn't they go on Truth Social the other week and say they want to shoot drones down?
Yeah. And I don't recommend anyone do that because it's highly illegal to do something like that. So please, most cases, I mean, there's some cases where it might be okay, but I mean, I don't want to encourage anyone to do something that's going to get them locked up, right?
Right.
But I think all this should lead to, I think, a bigger conversation about, incorporation of drone technology into our society, right? Like what does it mean? What does privacy mean when we have drones? People who are able to, fly around very close to your place of living and potentially get pictures inside your house, right? Or follow your pattern of life. I mean, I think there's a good argument to be had of, where is that line between privacy and public area, public arena, what can be captured, what can be used. I think, and that's not a new debate, right? I mean, between the paparazzi and several stars, that debate's always ongoing, and even with the news media, that's always a debate that's ongoing between what's for public consumption and what's where have at what point have we violated somebody's privacy? What is private? What is considered private, right? And I think that's going to be an ongoing debate as we talk about drones kind of permeating our society more and more. The Waymo example is a great one, right? I mean, we know. I mean, a lot of us know, maybe not everybody, but we know that our smartphones, you know, most of the apps on there are listening to what we're saying, catching keywords, location tracking, right? And to your point about the cars, people, you're informed, you're told this is what's happening, and people, hey, whatever, I'm gonna keep my phone on, I'm gonna have conversations. about whatever, right? Question is, when you're in a Waymo, right? What's being recorded? What's being captured? What's being stored? How long is it being stored? Right? I mean, these are all questions that I think will come up. You know, even at the airport security line, now they're taking pictures of your face as you go through TSA, and they tell you it won't be stored. It won't be. It'll be deleted immediately. But do I get a receipt that says that it's been deleted? How do I know? Right? I don't know. Right? I don't know. We don't know. Yet
Right.
I use Clear and they have my face stored and they have my biometrics stored. Right? So it's like I'm cool with Clear having it, but I'm not cool with the TSA agent having it. Right? So this is one of those issues that I think is always going to be ongoing on what where that line of privacy is, and I think the difference between the smartphone and the drone is, I don't know when the smartphone is doing it. I don't know when it's collecting on me. I don't know when it's listening to me. I don't know when it's tracking my location. It just does it, and I'm none the wiser. I can see the drone. I can hear the drone. I can watch it following me. It's creepy, right? It's like, I don't know why is this drone following me? Why is it flying around my house? Like, you get that your spider senses go up pretty high. And I think that's an uncomfortable feeling for a lot of people, knowing that they're being monitored that overtly. It makes people uncomfortable. And I think that's a discussion that's going to happen too. It's where does commercial and recreational drone use fall in our society, right? I mean, you think about a 400-foot ceiling, that's not very high, considering, like, so even if, like, I think people can misconstrue the thing. Like, if I'm flying at 350 feet, I'm 50 feet below my ceiling, right? And I'm just flying recreationally around a park. There's people who are like, why is that? I can see the drone. I can hear it. Like, why is there a drone here? I mean, that can very easily be misconstrued as the drone's following me, even though I'm just running a recreational route around a park or something like that, or, trying to capture some footage of a sunset or something like that, which a lot of people do. I mean, there's a lot of drone operators out there that are just trying to get some good content, capture some good stuff, doing everything responsibly, easily be misconstrued simply because of, where exactly they're flying or what exactly they're looking at.
Right.
So I think it's going to be an interesting conversation moving forward, as how we go with this. And then you're looking at drone delivery from Amazon, like that potentially might happen. Autonomous delivery with Waymo, right? Waymo, you just have a car that shows up at your house with no driver, and then the packages come out and stop. So there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of great technologies out there, but that can be very misconstrued, especially if there's a narrative pushed by political leaders or social leaders about, I guess, the intentions behind the technology, right? It's easy to pick something, or take something and then weave a little story and put it out there and get people riled up about something, right? I mean, it's easy to do that, especially in today's society when we have access to, X, Truth Social, Instagram, probably several other means of mass communication, YouTube, and you can just put something out there, put the dots out there, connect them very loosely, and people will latch onto it and say that's exactly what's happening. So, it, you know,
So it sounds like this week's top tip is going to be don't believe the hysteria.
yeah. I mean, I think, one, don't believe the hysteria, but also do your research, right? I mean, I think for me, it's always about doing my own due diligence before I come to a conclusion. You tell me that there's UFOs flying around New Jersey. Okay, cool. That's the initial report. Great. I'm gonna do my own independent research. Say, okay, well, what is this, right? You go through, you read the UAS regulations, you start realizing, oh, well, you can't just throw a drone up there and start flying it. There's a process involved here, right? So there's data points to be followed up on, right? I think that's that's the issue. Is if you just take what you see on, the news, social
Social.
media, the internet, and you just take it for face value without doing your own due diligence, you're just feeding into the hysteria, right?
Yeah. All right. So we're almost hitting top of the hour. So
Okay. Good talk.
what's our big takeaway for the week for everyone who's listening?
Yeah, I think big takeaway is kind of like last week, but focus on your business continuity and disaster prep. Have you? When was the last time you looked at the program? Have you done a rehearsal? If you haven't, do a rehearsal. Do a rehearsal, and then make sure that you can actually be resilient. Make sure your plan actually supports resiliency. Because it may, like to your point, it may support survivability, which is important, but we want resiliency. We don't just want survivability; we want resiliency. Uh,
Yeah.
so, um, look at those things. Look at your plans, dust them off, revamp them, take a look at it. When it comes to crazy events like drones, or who knows what next week will bring us, lizard people, maybe, I don't know. But when it comes to these things, as security managers, and planners, I mean, do your due diligence, right? Like, don't just feed off the hysteria. Do your due diligence. Educate your leaders. Educate your workforce on what's actually going on. They're going to be freaking out. Your job is to not freak out. Your job is to keep them, bring calm to the storm, right? Literally and figuratively, bring the calm to the storm, and educate them on what's happening and what's not happening, and is there an actual issue here, right?
Yeah. I would say the big takeaway we need to think about is just the what could possibly go wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Assume the worst case scenario. Like even if your plans, assume it caught fire. Like it's in the building. Like you can't access your binder. Like now what happens? What do you do then? It doesn't mean that you don't have a plan. You have to act because you have to survive, whether it be individually or business. So,
Yeah.
you have to not just test it, you have to also understand that you have to adapt to your point. You have to be willing to change on the fly because plans are gonna plans never really go right the first time around, or they never get implemented correctly because Jack won the lottery and now Jack's not in a company, but Jack is the person who declares a disaster and starts the disaster relief process.
Right.
So you know has to be flexible, has to be adaptable, has to be able to adapt to any number of situations, whether it be man-made or Mother Nature.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it, right? So, same
Which
goes with the planning.
which goes to remind you, for those of you who are listening to this, and it's looking for a personal gift to send people, maybe buy someone a disaster relief kit, like a first aid kit or something for
Yeah.
them. Might come in handy. Who knows?
It very well might.
All right, folks. Thanks for listening. It's been a pleasure and honor. We'll see you next week on the next episode when we do it, because we know I think next week is Christmas. But if there's anything else you want to hear from us, drop a comment below, subscribe, leave a comment on LinkedIn, message us. We'll always be happy to get some feedback on where you want to go next. So until then, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, Happy Hanukkah, and Happy New Year's to everyone if we don't see you until the New Year's.
Absolutely.
All right. Cheers, everybody.
Cheers, everyone.